Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the April 26th edition of the Microsoft 365 Meetup for Government. Very happy to have you all this evening and looking forward to tonight's presentation. I want to go over a few administrative items before we get started. The first of which is for anyone who is new to our community. This community's goal is to facilitate professional networking, development, learning, as well as cross-collaboration around all topics around Microsoft 365 and its applications within the public sector and government space. We have a few community standards that we like people to be aware of. These are common sense, really. We ask people to be respectful and professional to others. Please do not share any information that's non-public, confidential, or not yours to share. We certainly allow and encourage folks for self-promotion and relevant marketing or sales information, but we ask that people keep it reasonable and don't spam the group or otherwise get excessive with any promotions. And lastly, kind of goes without saying, this is a user community. Many of us work for organizations, be it Microsoft, government, or partners, but at least in the context of this community and these sessions, we're all here in our personal capacity, and our views or any information we're sharing don't necessarily reflect the official position of our employers or those organizations. I do want to thank two of my co-organizers, Andrew Kagan and Andy Oak from Planet Technologies. They've been an instrumental part of making these meetup sessions possible and helping continue to bring the great content that we've enjoyed over the past year to all of us who've benefited from it. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Nick Giard. I work with Microsoft as a program manager. Feel free to add me on social media. But enough about me. If you are new to the Teams platform, please just familiarize yourself with some of the controls, probably the most important of which is how to access the meeting chat, how to use the raise hand functionality, and then certainly if you want to ask a question or participate in a discussion, please feel free to come off mute. I'll defer to Brian if he wants to take questions throughout or save them to the end, but definitely we really encourage people to participate and ask questions and be involved as appropriate for the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Brian Turch. Brian is one of our best security and technology leaders within Microsoft Federal, and so very much always enjoy hearing his views and content on how to drive security and successfully facilitate hybrid work. So Brian, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Nick, and I'll write you the check you later for all the good words on the intro there. Let me share my screen. I'll flip my camera on for a minute as to say hi, and then I'll probably kick it off for a second there. Hi, everybody. As Nick mentioned, my name is Brian Turtz. I'm our federal civilian CISO these days and been in Microsoft for about 12 years now. So thanks for having me during this session, Nick. Thanks for the invite, and I look forward to it. So please feel free to ask questions anytime throughout. It's always boring if you're presenting for a long time and there's no chat or comments. Nick, because my screen's up, if anybody puts something in chat, just yell out and kind of grab me and stop where I'm at. I'm happy to answer and kind of pivot as we go. So thanks for the time, everybody. So I found this a good statement here about everything becoming more complex, not less complex and hybrid, from Satya, our CEO. And it's interesting, depending on how your processes, your procedures, or just your modalities of work that you're accustomed to within organizations. Simple tasks from getting a new computer to even just collaborating, a few years ago was very different, right? I mean, we've all been in certain modalities now for about 2 years because of COVID. But if you roll back the time, I remember how quite people were scrambling a bit, and we'll kind of talk about where we are and where we're going. But add this whole zero trust kind of conversation to this. I mean, things of how you control printing and data and flows and these new modalities that we have, right? And often throughout organizations, especially security leadership and different parts, we were always battling either functional business end users where we needed to go, and we constantly had this tug of war between getting yeses and nos, and hopefully we're turning those reds into greens over time that we have. And as people have kind of woken up to new capabilities, new constraints, controls, and new norms have been put into place. And I will say some of the hardest concepts to change within organizations are related to cyber. Take something as simple as password policies, right? And this has changed it for years now, that you don't need to rotate your passwords on a regular basis. Yet it's been ingrained in our head for eons. So some things that was once the norm is no longer the norm, and that takes a long time for people to accept that new principle as you move forward. And we see this all the time, right? We see cyber attacks, and we have a group within Microsoft that Nick and them are very familiar with called Mystic, our Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. And that's our nation state team. And I used to hang out with them a lot when we were in the office years ago. And I said, hey, are attacks just on the rise, or are we just getting better? And the answer I got was both, right? What's happening is we've implemented better tooling. I think cloud has helped in some ways. Cloud has had challenges in some ways, but in general, the security tools have improved. So we're gaining some visibility, which is causing us to find things that we may have not in the past, right? And if you look at big attacks like SolarWinds, the Colonial Pipeline, Log4Shell, Log4j, whatever name you want to call it, it feels like every day there's something new in our face. And the reality is, organizations, we are trying to look at our risk and how we handle our risk posture. Do we mitigate it? Do we transfer? Do we avoid doing those tasks? I mean, how do we know which way to go, and how do we adjust our tolerance based on either the times, the environments, or constraints that we may be dealing with? Because historically, going back to that yes and no, no was safe because do nothing meant nothing bad per se would change, right? And I always used to say, change is a positive aspect, and it's not that you're changing a bad decision. It's an evolution of a thought process or an evolution of an outcome. And the analogy would be, I was an old ROTC guy in the military, but if I had a battle tactic and I never changed it and I wasn't successful, what would I do? It's real-time battlefield decisions. We'll talk about how threat actors and how organizations deal with that today, right? But not only that, each organization, whether in the government or payment or whatever the industry you may be in, you have FISMA, you have DoD regulations, you kind of name your industry, PCI if you're doing payment card or a combination, that you have all these regulatory requirements. Look at executive orders recently that kind of pivot people quickly in uncomfortable ways. So not only do we have to stay secure, provide a business function, we have to meet our security and compliance requirements throughout the organization, all while adjusting how we function these days. And the only constant we have is change, right? Change is the only thing that's going to occur in the organization, right? If we all could throw our computers under the box and in the ground and bury them, we'd be super secure, but it wouldn't be too productive. And we realize that attackers don't go through supply chain problems that they deal with today, right? They don't go through FISMA requirements. They pivot and they move rapidly. They pop, drop, and stop, right? And they just keep going through your environment. So how can you pivot and adjust if you're not willing to change and adapt very quickly, right? And it's not just putting an indicator here. Sometimes it's changing entire procedures and processes that are uncomfortable for organizations. And COVID really did that for people, right? And 2 years plus ago now, I remember coming back from Seattle and San Francisco at that time, and when things shut down, and even being on internal Microsoft calls of how we had to scale out and handle things that were happening, to being on calls with entities and agencies that said they did things in weeks that take months in the past. So we were able to adjust in many cases, but people found they were stifled a little bit or challenged by what they had in place when this hit. And when our normal life became like this, and this is not my family, but I have 2 kids and the same thing of being the kids at home, the dog, the wife, the family, everybody for me, and constantly having to jockey that. And one thing that Satya said recently, there's this kind of interesting thing we'll talk about later related to being always on, right? When you're at work and you come home, you can kind of differentiate, let go. But when you work is always at your house, you're kind of this constant on fashion. So how do we disconnect from where we've been working today? in these new modalities. And a little joke, and it's not my dog, but I do have a picture of her. That one day I was in my office and the computer was down, and she must have bumped it and was standing there and staring at the screen. So I even say our pets have adjusted to this lifestyle, and we got her during COVID, and she knows nothing but us being home all the time, right? So everybody was impacted by these changes, but the reality in many places, some normalcies will never go back, and it's a good and a bad dilemma that you have to kind of jockey with, and we'll kind of work through some of those scenarios today of how we adjust in this new world and new lifestyle that we have. And how can we continue to be agile throughout that organization, right? We were able to adapt quickly in some cases, but whether it's pivoting for cyber, whether it's pivoting with FISMA, like how do we get into this constant norm that move quickly? If you think about a vendor like Microsoft and our cloud technologies, like it changes every day, good or bad, you might hate it, but the reality is constant innovation, constant change. So when you think of things like risk management framework 337, right, about continuous ATOs, how do you get there without being agile, right? How do you adapt quickly? And one of my favorite books to talk about, and I don't get paid, it's not mine, is the Phoenix Project or the Unicorn Project, which is the one that follows, right? Where they work through this thing called the theory of constraints, but they get to an agile methodology at the end of it where they can pivot on real-time decisions within organizations and entities, right? So whether it's pivoting by function, pivoting on data, we have to be able to react, or pivoting by something like a COVID. How do we keep that mindset moving forward as things open back up? And how do we continuously improve in our organizations, right? Where we're either quick changes, but let's not lose the momentum that we have. How do we continue to improve? Because you're never zero trusted, right? You're never secured. You're doing things to secure and put controls and to mitigate risk. But the reality is we can always improve from where we go. And let's decouple our mindset from a tool and a solution per se, and work on just improving a methodology and not worry about a decision we made at one point or 3 years ago or so forth. Because again, it's not a failure in your decision, it's an improvement or an evolution of your thought to move you forward, to evolve that thought process, to improve as we go forth. And too many people see change as negative, and it could be. So if you look at NIST 800-207 here, I highlighted a few pieces of this that kind of get into this remote work scenario for us. And one of my favorite things to talk about in my undergrads and networking, right? My master's is cyber, things like that. But if you look at the concept of no implicit trust, and we always say trust but verify, it's not a new concept, but the reality of the past was inside my infrastructure, we implied trust and we thought we were safer inside that infra, where we've been getting hacked and popped for years. Some cases we don't even know about it until they're gone. Right. And so if we look at the first thing about physical network location not being one of the basis or sole basis of trust, that means your inside network, and call it inside outside, right? Inside being your corporate infrastructure, is no different than being at Starbucks, right? So yes, there's some technical changes and dependencies, but the reality is they should be treated the same. So if I'm no more safe or secure in my corporate entity by default as I am at Starbucks, then what is my network nowadays? And then we get into asset ownership, whether it's personally owned or BYOD or government owned GFE or however you want to classify it. So now it's regardless of who owns it and regardless of where I am, I don't trust any of it. So how do I function in this modern day, and what does my network look like in a modern principles like this? It doesn't mean we throw out legacy or traditional controls by any means. It's just a different way of thinking of how we put controls and mitigations in place for the organization. So in the newer world, just it's happening by flow anyways, is that our data is starting to move. We're going to always have hybrid. We're going to have high side infrastructures and disconnected, but there's clouds on those sides too. But the general point is most of our data is starting to leave and move beyond our traditional infrastructure that we have. And when you're using Salesforce or Box or G Suite or Office 365, what is your network then? That means the internet is technically your network. That's your means of communications, even if you use an express or private circuit or some type of service. The reality, they're internet facing services, right? How do you put a firewall between the Graph API in Azure, right, or Microsoft. Yeah, you can, right? I mean, you can use conditional based policy things, but there's certain things you just can no longer control by traditional means. So it means we have to think about things a little bit differently of what our threat points are, right? Where we put our mitigations, and networking is great and network controls are wonderful. But if we now start decoupling our mind from a physical entity as like the network, it changes how we look at access in your organizations, right? And this one's kind of oldie goodie, but the classic approach, right? Castle walls, kind of edge-based security. Yes, we still did defense in depth, right? That doesn't change, but that model has been proven wrong. You could go back to the Trojans letting in the horse, right? Or name your hack of the week that's happened over the last 10 years for you. And it's just an evolution. And if you talk about zero trust, it really goes back to something called the Jericho Forum about 15-ish years ago, with a concept called deperimeterization, right? Which is a mouthful for me to say, which is similar to that previous slide of releasing trust and doing policy-based enforcement, right? Continuous enforcement. And now 802.07 is kind of widely adopted, right? When I was talking about it 3, 4, 5 years ago, it was still very fringe and kind of getting on the edge, but now it's been embraced by everybody out there. And there's an evolution in the industry of making this a little more functional, right? So when you look at NIST 802.07, there's 3 logical components to this, and we'll kind of work through this as we go through. Identity, microseg, and software-defined perimeter, because too many people walk in, and I know who's on my t-shirt, right, where I work, and I say, look, you can't buy zero trust. If anybody tells you have a zero trust product, throw them out the office, throw them out the door. They don't know what they're talking about. Too many people name it that way for market share. Their solution fits into one of these 3 legs, and it's not an either or one, or I've done SDP and I'm done, I'm zero trusted. No, because SDP still needs identity, you still need microseg, right? So it's really a 3-legged stool, and if you think about it, it's comparable to the CIA triad of confidentiality, integrity, availability, but this is the zero trust legs that we have. And any one of these legs you don't have, your stool will fall over in a similar fashion. And each piece plays an important role for that in your organization to securing that. And if you look at inside of Microsoft, we've kind of started to blow away quote unquote corporate networks and branch offices and things like that. And it just depends on where you choose your risk tolerance and what one you put the most emphasis on. But if you think about it, anybody other than a DDoS in your environment, they need an identity to proliferate, to move laterally, to escalate privileges, to write a service principal like SolarWinds fill your data. You always need an identity. Very rarely can I have an anonymous. There's some vulnerabilities within solutions that typically allow privilege through anonymous, but the reality is somewhere I need an object, right, a subject to give me privilege and identity and movement. And we believe that's a big linchpin within the pillar, but it's not the sole pillar, right? I still need network segmentation. I still need SDP, and that how you do it via network or identity base, you still need it, right? And when you start talking about policy enforcement points and policy decision points, we truly believe that identity is very critical, but all the pieces play and communicate together. So as you start thinking about these remote work scenarios, and I start drilling down a second of how I have a remote endpoint or identity system or a tool and a tool and a tool, think about that. And not every tool plays nice with others today. And the concept of like open zero trust is kind of picking up a little bit more, but the reality it's a little fragmented the way it stands today. And putting a solution in place could break your communication channel that you really need for this, right? And so what's happened over the years, we had tools and tools and tools, identity endpoints, email collab apps, and different teams may run them and then different repos. And so then, years ago, we had, hey, let's get this SIEM thing, right, to aggregate our logs, and then we'll try to patch it together and kind of do these things for us. And reality is we see this every day that we're short on strong cyber people in the industry. We always need more. We always need threat hunters. We always need deep identity people. And it gets challenging, right? And very few organizations can get deeply staffed across the board. And why does this matter, right? And there's something I like to talk about called the 1-10-60 rule. And it's detect within a minute, investigate in 10, and kind of eliminate, and eradicate within an hour. Why is that relevant? If you look at most industry statements, within 24 to 48 hours, most of your network is completely owned and lateral movement happens within 2 hours. So CrowdStrike, Microsoft, major vendors tell you 30 to 6 months plus of dwell times before finding these adversaries quite often is the norm. So if your network's owned within 48 hours, but most people don't know it's till a month to 6 months, you're done, right? So what we need to do is we need to evolve how we get visibility into this data set, right? We need to enrich that and use modern things like AI and ML, which sounds very cliche, but we need to take all these signals and bring them together, right, throughout our footprint. And there's gonna be lots of vendors that feed to one another, but this telemetry sharing, going back to that kind of unified approach with SDP, identity, and microsig, but all of your tools must communicate together and get rid of these silos, so that way we can start having a communications channel between them. And on the Microsoft side, it looks something like this. The slides might be the older names, right? So it's Office 365, it's Teams, it's Azure AD, it's name your vendor of integration. But the reality is we see now somewhere around 40 trillion signals a day to do analytics on and behavior analysis on. It's not perfect, it's not impervious. But when each piece of the pie can feed the analytic section for us, now what I can start doing is adding automation and things to help me. It's not perfect. In my master's class once, the teacher was like, if you were on a beach in a desert, what would you want for your organization? Training, this, AI? And my answer was AI/ML. And I said, I broke the norm from everybody else. I said, the reality is I'm probably short staffed, understaffed, don't have enough people, because what I hear all the time. So I want something to augment and take the basic tasks away from my team so they can focus on the more enriched capabilities. I want them to find an event, start a triage, start an investigation, pull the data back and do 10 tasks before it gets to my analyst. So now my analyst can focus down versus doing those 10 tasks that are very basic. So by having a system in place that can help automate, can help be a little more productive, there's no magic security bullet that'll solve all problems, but we're talking about same thing in the Phoenix project, right? With that theory of constraints, I want to reduce or wrap my constraint points, which are high-end folks in cyber that can do big data and analytics, right? And quite often we get into these tools, and I'm like, tools like this are table stakes these days, right? If you really come to me and talk to me about cyber, it's data science and data analytics and modeling, right? That's where it goes. But the reality is most people don't have data scientists. They don't have these. So tools like this can augment an organization and help enrich your teams that may not have those skills. And then as your organization matures, you morph into that more advanced kind of left to right and within your entities that you have. And as you start looking at breaking that apart, we talk about this concept of a kill chain, right? Or MITRE ATT&CK that's out there. And this is again how Microsoft fits into this. And you talk about, hey, where can I break this chain, right? And how's this relevant to remote work as I tie this together in a minute? How do I make my endpoint? What can I do there to quarantine, isolate? How do I look at behavior analytics with an identity? How did I see an email that went to a user that went to an endpoint that clicked and did something weird? And how do I protect everybody else? So a system that can communicate that and block it for the others, update itself, and snap the kill chain can reduce and help you hit that 1-10-60 rule, right? Because I need to do some magic really quickly within an hour, because within a few hours, most likely depending on threat, compromise, or attack, I might be done and over with and not even know it. And before I figure it out, they come gone and took my data, and which gets into other ways that we need to look at protections going forward. So when we start talking about this new world that we're in and these operating models, the places, people, and process, a little different than the triple Ps we talk about in NIST, but how do we operate in this new world and these dimensions of hybrid work where work sites and locations and hours can be anytime and anywhere? I think it was Deloitte about a year ago, give or take. They came out and said, work any hours, work wherever you want. There is no more come to the office if you don't want to. And that changes the paradigm of this kind of 9 to 5 or night and weekend or however your work tier was for you, and that we have to support as an organization. And that's a culture shock. But I've dealt with some senior leaders and entities and agencies. I said, well, a positive is if you're in DC, now your workforce can be the whole United States. You've just exposed yourself to additional talent, but you also exposed yourself to additional challenges. Obviously, working on high side infrastructure changes that, but it's culturally different. I was in the DoD years ago, and it's go mow the dirt out there, right? Or must sit in the seat in an empty room just to show that you're there. That's not productive, right? So, but there's this cultural aspect that some people have embraced, other people swing back. You know, some people need social interaction, but it's something different within the organizations. But something as simple as getting a new computer. How does we work in this? If I never come to the office, if I have this modality anymore of walking in, you know, I'm SCCM certified 20 years ago, and I remember when I used to work in the DoD space or joint space, we had these disk duplicators, right? We used to plug them in and clone the drive, and you pray 5 out of 10 times that it worked for you, and you spent hours imaging with this machine, right? And that's it doesn't fly nowadays, all right? It's one, technology's gotten better, but two, how do we change? I mean, when I used to get a new device in my house, or many of us at work, and we were just in a meeting in the office the other day talking about new devices, and people, oh, that's cool, that's nice, right? And you know, I used to have a Ralphie Red Ryder BB gun one here, but when we used to get a new computer, we used to get very excited, right? I bought a new toy. We have a new shiny widget, a new phone, a new thing, right? That's going to make me better, more productive, and improve upon my life. But quite often, we then found we were missing data, we were missing applications. We found it took so long to get to us. There was an army of people doing that configuration, when the reality is we just wanted to get to work with our new device and kind of be productive, right? So how do we do that in this new world of remote work, right? We had these days, whether it's USB stick or you name the method. I remember doing SCO Unix for school systems, God, a long time ago, and we lined up 30 computers in a room and plugged them in the monitors and stuck 20 CDs in the machines and hit next, and that was mass blasting right there, setting up all those machines in the same room. But that was very high touch. And in a expanded world, in a remote world that doesn't work too well, we could ship it to the office, do the same processes that we want, and reship it. That may increase our costs. But the reality is, I want to do speed implementation. And what if we could do that via policy driven scenarios, right? What if I didn't have to do the same thing? But this is getting back to how we change mentally and how we accept things. Well, something like autopilot, right? And inside of Microsoft, and I did a thing a couple of years ago at a power company, and literally it's got my new computer, so it was perfect timing for me. And it showed up at my house, and I turned it on. I connected it to the internet here, and I logged into the device, and it did its magic. And about 10 minutes went by, and I was done. And I turned to my wife and I said, I feel like I'm supposed to do something, but there's nothing left to do but run Windows Update, because my email was in Office 365. I had Teams, I had OneDrive, my applications came back. All the stuff that I really needed to be productive was delivered to me from just opening a device and onboarding it, right? Now you could do custom images within your manufacturers that you work out. You could do off the shelf type scenarios that we allow in Microsoft, that when policy hits, it reconfigures, it changes it to an enterprise image. I don't have to be very high touch to get to the outcome that I want. But that's a procedural change that people have to understand, that when this device connects, it gets provisioned, it brings it into the security stack, it pushes policy, whether it's STIGs or you name it. You go, well, what if it doesn't work? What if policy doesn't work? What if something doesn't apply? Well, great. That's where we get into this minute. We'll talk about conditional access and constraints that don't allow access to the device if it's not compliant against policy. So all of the things we used to have to very much touch to achieve, we can expedite and bring a better user experience to deliver to procurement to execute time. And something like this, and if I get time based on what we have, I'll show some of the stuff more live. But what if the minute my machine came up, and my buddy Rhett, that Nick and them know, years ago did an internal event called Ignite, and a public event called Ignite, and he did something similar to this on stage, and he had some processes kick off fake malware. And when the machine was booting up, it's still to Ubi, the blue screen, right, saying processing, all that stuff. He was already getting alerts in his dashboard like this, saying he had issues and vulnerabilities. So the machine wasn't even done onboarding. It was provisioned automatically into the management system that brought it into the security system for like endpoint detection response, EDR, and started doing kind of that flight recording analysis and inventory and risk assessments right there for us. So I can get to where I need to be through a nice process without having to be very manual for us, and still get that level of security within the organization that the staff needs, and that visibility in some cases more than you had today, right? And when I used to talk about Azure and platforms historically, I'm like, hey, I can see more than you can normally because everything goes through an API, everything has a control point, right? That I have, which means that I can put a policy related to it and get exposure to it. So when I kind of get in that modality of I can get a device to anybody where, provision it properly, provide the hooks that I need, control, I'll show you later about printing and everything, then that allows me to be flexible and look at the places where people can work. And this will be our new office, Nick. I hope this will be mine one day, but that means I technically anywhere I have connectivity can perform my job. So again, what are we trying to mitigate? We're looking at threats and vulnerabilities and what risks they pose to our organization. Is it in this one? Is it data? Is it data exfiltration, device theft, the device encrypted? Is it malware on the machine that gets installed, downloaded, websites you go to? But what if I can control that just like I did when I was in my network? So I don't need to be inside the cookie center anymore to gain the same controls that I once thought I needed to do it that way. So this flexibility, one, can help improve work lifestyle, can make a better experience, can open up talent pools that you have, but yet I'm still going to meet my regulatory and security compliance requirements within the organization. A simple example, if you look at M2209, recently released in the last 6, 8 months, right? But the updated one basically says, hey, highlight the first one. You need to make an application expose to the internet without a VPN. That's blasphemy years ago, right? But literally, this is mandated an edict from the government, senior leadership, to say you must do this. This helps drive you into that cultural change. So they had a policy to force that change to allow people to see the comfort and see how they can do this in a secure fashion. This gets into that STP action, right? That software defined perimeter. There's different ways you can execute this, but you're seeing this now. You're seeing the DoD do BYOD and download to unmanaged assets. You're seeing people think that they can, or show that they can work in different ways. That COVID and this modality change forced people into that cultural aspect so that they were willing to say, hey, I am safer. Hey, I am more productive. Hey, I do have more visibility. Look at the data and analytics I have. And I can move into being a data-driven organization, whether it's with people, and we'll talk about that later with Viva, or how I do learning in my organization. But when we circle back to that zero trust aspect of it, right, and we look at the different pieces of identity and the data, in Microsoft, we said there was 6 pillars that we had, right, and CISA did 5 pillars. The DoD, I think, did 7, but we all have about the same things. It's just how we identify them, right, in there. So they're about the same principle sets with zero trust. But when you think about that previous statement of authentication and conditional-based policy controls, I'm feeding in data from the endpoint, from the management plane, data that we have using something like a CASB to do session-based control or policy and API control to things like Box and G Suite that are out there, and using that identity pivoting point or using something like App Proxy to do SDP. So when you're looking at, just not mentioning microseg in this one, but when you look at those 3 pillars of 207, they're here on the screen. Again, different vendors do different things, and it doesn't all have to be all Microsoft by any means. But when you look at how you do that, it's about that cohesive conditional based thing. An Active Directory on-prem just doesn't do this. You authenticate, you get a curb ticket, you get a typical 8 hours lifetime, and you could hack the whole network and it just looks at you funny, right? But in a modern claim system like an Azure AD, or something using MDI for behavioral, we have these conditional based things, CAE, conditional access evaluation. So when you look at conditional access or conditional evaluation, that's the whole heart of zero trust. And the fact that in the future, we'll see even network packets have identities one day, right? Everything is about a conditional assessment. I can use things like step-up authentication. It's technically called authentication context, but it sounds easier to say step-up auth. Where now I've gone through some conditions, And now I access some data that may have higher sensitivity that then tells me to go back because of that re-multi-factor, go through another different set of conditions because of my data. So now based on data sensitivity, I get through another set of conditions that we have. Based on my behavioral change that I do, I get flagged as being risky based on my risk tolerance. Maybe I'm bumped from access to the system. So these inner workings have to happen in near real time for you. And we're going to go over every one of these little icons. Just kidding, right? Just to show you, it's not a Microsoft world. It's an ecosystem out there. There's going to be multiple cloud vendors. There's going to be multiple SaaS applications. There's going to be multiple networking vendors, but they all need to play in this kind of this same sandbox and work with that linchpin of identity that we have that works in a condition modality that's there for us. And again, using something like we mentioned about the endpoint being onboarded, Microsoft case for MD, and then to MEM or MTune or MECM, to then say, hey, I could authenticate, and no, I can't access that system or I'm restricted because of my device or threat levels until I get remediated. This sounds a lot like old school NAC on my infrastructure. I can't comply to connect, right? But when I don't control the network at Starbucks, how do I NAC Starbucks? I don't, right? So I now can move to different modalities of where the device becomes an isolation point. And if I don't like that device, I can knock it off the network. My favorite thing to do, and if I had time today, I'd do it so my son would come screaming down here. So when my kid's bad, I'll isolate his computer. And no matter what he does, if I'm not around, I can't do anything on it anymore. So I have hooks to put that microseg around an individual device and quarantine it and then do remediation and triage and start doing firewall at that level and moving in those modalities as the systems evolve and the capabilities keep improving. I then can do more and more analysis before access, which is what we really wanted, right? We want this adaptive control system out there that's managed identities or service principals, whether it's BYOD, how do I handle the scenario, or a managed device, or the sites or things that I go to. And oh, I think it dropped on me when I was sitting here. There we go. And here's an example of, this is a Win11 VM that I'm running, and I was doing this demo for someone earlier, and I literally blocked Twitter and YouTube and ESPN. There's no firewalls doing this, right? I created policies that added categorization or blocks within the system, and anywhere in the world that the machine is running, I've now just blocked whatever sites that I wanted to based on that content. I don't have to VPN and back through a proxy. The endpoint system allows me to do this, right? So as we start looking at where we start making controls, if I move away from some of the network base, and there's still various ways to do networking, or how do I control machines in the ether? Well, why does my EDR systems allow me to do many of the network controls that I did before in a centralized way, but decentralized? So I can start looking at access and things a little bit differently for us. When I talk about the people, which is the heart and soul of the organizations, and many of us have just kind of started full time going back into the office or in various stages. I know when I first, during COVID a little earlier, we had to upload our COVID vaccination information and attest that we were fine when we went to the office. But adding things like a Power App or some type of application in the mix to help us manage, we won't see the last pandemic. Hopefully it's the last one in my lifetime, but we'll always have threat of something. It happens every so often, but maybe it's not a pandemic, maybe it's a crisis, maybe it's something else that causes some other inflection point in how we run our businesses and operate the agencies that we're at. But kind of working in this kind of modern environment of who's where, how do we calm, how do I track people, self-attestation or so forth, or book access to rooms. I change this into different ways for people to do that. But then what about the people that may never be coming back into the office? I've talked to many agency folks that are like, hey, I moved to Florida, I'm in Iowa, I'm in Kansas, and that's where they are from now. And some folks will always be remote, and more that's going to become the request and new norm for many people is as talent gets stretched, if someone's like, hey, do I have to come in, they might say no thank you, and therefore you have to modify where you are. I once was talking to someone in high level in an entity, and they said, can I hire you to go downtown 5 days a week? I said, nope, I sure wouldn't. And so you have to look at how these flexibilities can expand your organization and access that you have. But not only that, what about the people that aren't in the room with you anymore? how do we be inclusive to those people so that we don't lose them in the conversation, or make them feel that they're being left out? Maybe there's something like a service hub or however you change it, but we have to understand that we now have hybrid folks, remote folks, and maybe this is a little bit normal for us than it was a few years ago. When I was one of our infra architects in the MTC, I delivered sessions 8 hours a day on these things in even the old versions, and back before that, smart boards. And it was, something to challenge sometimes when you'd have a few people remote and 10 in the room, and you had to kind of get accustomed to working in that modality for it to be inclusive in your organization. But now it's going to be the new norm that people are always in this. How do we set up rooms to be inclusive? How do we make sure we're including those in there? And looking at things like within teams, like the join group, to kind of give us that look of being in the room together, or how we communicate. I was on a conference call with someone else today, pulls up a chat while I'm doing my briefing to ask a question to someone to do that, right? And we just learned, some of the folks, I'd get on long-winded calls, and me and Nick know I can talk a long time with people, and especially during COVID, we would do happy hours over Teams, or I would start chatting with someone like this. And Friday I was talking to this guy Steve, and we're gonna go, hey, it's gonna be 5 minutes, not an hour, Brian. And an hour and 20 minutes later, we're still talking, right? And so it becomes a social experiment for us in many cases. But how do we collaborate or even automate processes through things like Power Apps and Power BI, and get data in this central thing? Teams is a window to an experience. And it's not just chat or meetings. It's really the debate of, is it SharePoint, is it not, is always the joke, right? But it's a window into whatever you want it to be. And even nowadays with things like Viva, bringing those things together and looking at, hey, you need to take a break, right? When we're in these world, I've been going most of the day, and then I got school tonight even, but when you start looking of, hey, you've been on the computer for 8 hours, right? And doing this, maybe you just need to step away. What if we can now use analytics, not to monitor teams, but to improve experiences, to recommend things for them, to connect people in the organization, or even within the learning piece that we have, right? How do we get our training done, that we have? And, as we integrated LinkedIn Learning into this, and the Viva Learning became, Lord knows, at Microsoft, we have a ton of training that we have to do all the time, I feel like. So keeping it in a modality that I'm already working in and keeping my life simpler is better for me. But even that, going back into this concept of digital exhaustion that we have, right? Going back to that statement of Satya, and people always, your home is now your permanent workplace, and you never leave your workplace. I can tell you that many a nights I get the worst thing I could do is check my phone at 10:30 at night, because I'm done and I can't go to sleep till 3 in the morning because something bothered me. There's an issue, and I'm too wired up. So how do we decouple and kind of take these mental breaks from that? And if a system can help us there, hey, give your mind a break. How are you feeling today? If you can get this kind of relative feedback, maybe it can help us be a little bit happier in our workplace that we have, understand that we need to walk away, kind of turn a system in a benefit instead of another task, another place that we have to use and do, right? Let's start kind of being a place where it's beneficial and provides value, right? The old joke of NSA collects less data than Facebook and people do on you, but people happily give it away, right? Why is that? They perceive a benefit to it. So if these systems can provide beneficial experiences to us, can provide analytics to the organization, again, going back to how do we become a data-driven organization, and look in real time, not just spreadsheets and things that we have that we're making assumptions and estimated and doing qualitative things. Maybe we can have some more quantitative, factual numbers there that we can improve productivity within our organization. We can improve the user experience that produces the outcome, right? If you look at the old econ 101 type statements when I was taught it, right? So the concept of a kid that was a baker or in the field, and as he was a baker, he stared out the window all day and had limited productivity. But you put him in the field, he was amazing and could do great things. So if we can find the right data, the right metrics to provide incentives to work efficiently and let everybody be happy, that's a great thing for us, right? And bring that learning experience in the same place by FISMA, by NIST, right? We all have to do regular training. Number one way for cyber and things is awareness training with the organizations. But again, if I'm in a comfortable experience that's not intrusive to me, that allows me to create work plans, that allows me to create education plans for myself and improve my career, find things of value, and again, keep me working in different ways, is a wonderful thing, right? Well, as we keeping track of my time here, Nick, as we start getting into the data aspect of things, hey, I'm on the beach in Tahiti with my Wi-Fi. Who's copying things to USBs? Where's my data going? Well, the reality is historically been really bad about data classification, right? In many places, we haven't had good ways to classify that information, not top secret and secret, but really just define things that are metrics around a document or an information that tag it with that right metadata that allow me to see where my data moves. Well, as we move more data to cloud and things like Salesforce and Box and G Suite and Office 365 and OneDrive, my data is proliferated. So I need a way to make sure that internal information and corporate data is not really passing those bounds or being shared externally, whether it's insider activity, accidental activity. But what if I can control and look at my data sets and find that stuff? And of course, this is Microsoft 365 compliance. And if you have to make internal Microsoft jokes like I like to do, it's now Purview is the name of everything, because we'll change our names next week again, right? So when you think about that purview or that visibility of your data, finding data from databases to things like storage blobs to and more structured places or files in OneDrive, to allow me to create rules and trainable classifiers and things to tag that data, that allows me to take it one step further and see what's going on. So if you ever seen me do a live demo, and I have the screen, let's just do it real. You'll see, and hopefully I haven't lost my timing yet here. Oops, my timeout, I knew it was gonna happen. All right, you can see me, here's the same thing, but one thing I'm looking at is, hey, what about this remote thing that's out there? And sorry, I lost my session. I knew it was gonna happen right now. I'll go back to my slides. What I normally pull up and what I was about to do is I manage my family. That's how I play around. But I pull up all my family members and I see what they're printing, the devices they're printing on the file. I don't look at the data, right? I have tags on the data that says, hey, there's PII, there's sensitive stuff. My sister does a lot of contracts. And I can see every time she's printing out a contract, what the printer is, what the hash of the file is. So in that same beach, I'm sitting there, who's copying content, restricting copy, and I can block it, audit it, I can do this stuff. So I can control data movement. I can protect data. Maybe I'm letting it move, but I'm encrypting it, adding confidentiality. So if it is device stolen or USB stolen, then I have now at least protected the content that can't be accessed without the de-encrypting the device or the asset itself. So if I can restrict the printing, I can't stop you from taking a picture of my screen, but that's going to happen regardless of where you are. But if I can start getting labeling of data, controlling data movement, controlling visibility, regardless of where that is, if it's in OneDrive or SharePoint or Teams or Power BI, and I can start creating policies that integrate with Cisco and Box and Dropbox and Amazon that can now find that data and control, tag, label. Now, again, where I'm coming from becomes a little less relevant. And I can add conditional policies with GPS and things like that to try to do geolocation, things like that. But I could bounce off a VPN and spoof that, right? But if I start adding multi-factor encryption, all these gates and conditional policies into things, now I don't really care so much that my data is hosted externally because it's protected and encrypted and confidential, regardless of the vendor. Microsoft or Amazon can't see into that data set. So therefore, there's a level of protection to my personal corporate data that I have. So creating those rule-based decisions that you can do can lead into the final piece that we have for processes, right? How do I take these process that I have, again, going back to Phoenix or the Unicorn Project of how do I take these constraints with my organization, wrap the constraints to be agile or to be able to pivot? How do I empower that kind of citizen developer or that a business unit to create something secure that accesses data in a responsible way, that empowers the organization. I was an infra guy, right? I ran servers and workstation, you name it, for 20 some years, right? And I always say I want something that does the mundane tasks for me. I'm a highly paid entity. I want to work on the data. I want to work on the big things for the enterprise. I want to look at the strategy of where we're going. I don't need to do the basics. So what if, and I'll pray for someone who does this for the badge process at a government agency for me, that I could go through a simple process that I see where the workflow is, see who's the task, who has this, where it's assigned, where it is in the process, how can I kind of improve these things? There's various ways to do this, or even just pivot on data that I have. So providing your business, your end user, your analysts with a simple way to empower them within the platform to create something, right? You still need to respect the data integrity, the least privileges that you need in your organization, and the constraints on the data that you have, regardless of what tool, technique, or process that you're delivering. But if you can do that by quickly identifying data, like we've talked about in the Purview and Microsoft's cases, to allowing them access based on their role and function, and keep away from privilege creep and things like that, and keep away from aggregation of data to do things in certain ways, I've then now allowed people to be empowered in a secure fashion and give me visibility they may not have had before. So with that said, that kind of ends the conversation, the presentation piece. And sorry, my live stuff timed out on me during this. And I hope that was beneficial to everybody. My little pitch there on how modern work and hybrid work are going forward together within an organization and entity. So thank you for the time. And if there's any questions, let me know.
Brian, that was stellar. I definitely learned a lot, and I thought I was very well versed in the subject before hearing your talk. So definitely want to open it up to the floor. Anyone who has questions, please feel free to come off mute or put your questions in the chat with the remaining time. I do know that Brian does need to, or not Brian, yeah, Brian needs to get out of off here before too long, so we won't be able to stay on too late, but definitely want to make sure that folks have a chance to answer their questions.
No? All right.
I think it's 6 p.m. on a Tuesday, so I'm sure everybody's looking to get outside. So, if anyone has any follow-up questions, definitely please feel free to post them within the Meetup discussion forum, and we can circle back with Brian. We will get the recording of this session posted in a couple days. But Brian, really want to thank you for taking the time to share this information and walk us through this whole story. And again, tremendous job. And I think I speak for everyone when I say I learned a lot. Oh, looks like we have a question in the chat. So, Rock, you want to come off mute? So it looks like the question is, we are moving to Dynamics 365. Which class should I take to learn about how to set up business units, teams, security roles, security permissions, and access levels? Ryan, do you have any suggestions on if there's certifications or training you've heard of that aligns with this across the Microsoft Cloud?
Yeah, so not knowing who you work for and with, there's a couple answers to that. Generally speaking, one, there's a bunch of stuff on LinkedIn Learning if you have access to that. Two, if you want to start out at kind of the brass roots of things, there's a bunch of fundamental courses. There's one for Dynamics. There's M365 that kind of give you kind of ground truth of the 101s and kind of move up from there. So depending on where you're looking at roles, permissions, and how deep you have your M365, like security certifications, if you're looking for that. In general, there's a lot of content online. Some of the Ninja training, you have to look for Dynamics, but I know in the M365, there's a bunch of Ninja series out there that you can go to that's non-chargeable or free type training that you can do. So if you are at a large entity or agency, there is a program we have all called Enterprise Skills Initiative that provides included, can't use free with the government, right? Included training on everybody in their organization, instructor led with certifications and things like that as well. So that's one option for you. So there's a few things out there from a number of certifications that step up. I think the Dynamics ones start with DP, if I remember right. And then the MW ones start with MS for the nomenclatures out there. So.
Great, thanks. Any other questions before we let Brian go?
Is there any link that you can provide to me for registering different classes? I'm honestly not looking for any certificate, but I'm very concerned about learning about dynamics and all those business unit, team, security, and so forth to learn more about it. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Maybe we can post some, or maybe I'll throw some at the end of the deck or something that Nick will share out and put it out there for you.
Yeah, we'll definitely we'll see what we can find and share some out as a follow-up. Okay, well, Brian, I know you need to hit the road, so thank you again. And I'm going to end the recording and thank you for everyone who was able to attend this evening. Have a great rest of your evening, and we will see you again next month.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everybody.